This topic is coming back around to plants that are suffering, basically. So the field of plant pathology, maybe you've had to go through a pathologist in your lifetime. If you have something tissue that get biopsied or something, they send it to a pathologist. And in humans, pathology is like, what's wrong with you? And it's related to this Greek word pathos, related to sympathy, so feeling or suffering. So what do plants suffer from? What does a plant suffer from? All right, so tissue damage. Diseases, parasites. I guess a lot of it comes down to being eaten. So parasites you probably wouldn't count in the herbivore category. Smaller organisms, bacteria. Right, so I think we often think about plants as the base of the food chain, and rightfully so, right? So when we talk about nutrients in an ecological community, then plants are the organism that's making the food for a lot of those other parts of the community. So plants definitely get eaten. I'll throw bacteria, microbes, and we'll throw fungus in there too, fungi. Tissue damage, we'll get to that. We'll talk about that as another form of plant pathology. So there are people who are plant pathologists. Maybe you see yourself heading in that direction as a career. I don't know how well they get paid, but I imagine they get paid pretty well. Like if you are basically like the plant doctor who can look at a plant and say, I know what's wrong with your plant. Certainly in a crops or horticulture context, that would be agriculture or horticulture. That would be a desirable thing to have information about. And a lot of times it does come down to what is the organism that is eating my plant, but not always. So let's see what we got here in the old slide packet. So one thing that's outside of the realm of being eaten is just a plant that's maybe in an environment that it can't do well enough in. So could be some of these more abiotic problems. When we talked about nutrients, so soil nutrients that plants need, they can be short on those nutrients and show that as their like manifest that in the color of their leaves or something like that. So an illustration here of a plant that's got a magnesium deficiency. This was one of our mobile nutrients, if you remember that. So a nice illustration. This is yellowing in the older leaves. So what's happening here is this plant is short on magnesium. And I only know that because they told me this when I got the image. But it's short on magnesium. It's taking it from the older leaves and shuttling it out to the new growth. So these new leaves are okay. They're doing nicely, good shade of green. These new leaves good shade of green, but the older leaves are yellow. So this is a plant that's it's got only so much magnesium to go around. It's sacrificing older tissue so that it can keep growing toward maybe toward new light sources or something like that. So this is one way you might see a plant so-called suffering that's different from just being eaten. If you have some nutrients, you can have too many nutrients. So it's possible to get too many nutrients and have that be a problem. This is a lot of times like an osmotic problem. So roots maybe being unable to take up water because there are too many salts in the soil, maybe upsetting the chemical balance inside of cells. So if you fertilize your plants, you might be at risk sometimes of over-fertilizing them. And this is what could happen. So just like us, if you had too much salt in your diet, that affects your body's ability to make use of the water that you have. And people can die if they eat, say you're stranded on the ocean and you drink only salt water, that will kill a person. So same thing for a plant. If it's only taking up salty water, lots of cellular damage there. Anybody have a lawn that looks like this? What causes your lawn to look like this? Sometimes urine. So I love the internet. You can always find something useful, right? So people who are advocating that maybe we should be putting urine onto our plants. I think I have this on here to make the point that a little bit is okay, a little bit can be good. So a lot of animal waste is positive input for a plant, right? So big component of urine is ammonia. Ammonia has usable nitrogen. Plants like nitrogen. So from that perspective, nitrogen good, add some nitrogen to your plants, they can benefit from that. Too much nitrogen, so if you have an animal that is causing some burned spots in your yard, this might be due to a dog in your house peeing in spots. So dog urine can cause burn in the lawn, so it's too salty for too long in that area, that can kill the grass in that spot. So everything in moderation, right? Another form of damage that's not caused by animals, temperature extremes. So plants wilting, I think we probably have some familiarity with plants that wilt when they have too little water. This is a plant that's not adapted to live in cold areas where frost happens. So if you have any avocado plants outside right now, they're probably not doing very well. So as a plant that's native to tropical areas, this one doesn't lose its leaves. It's not preparing for winter. Caught completely off guard. Sometimes this happens if you live in an area that doesn't usually get frost, and sometimes it does get frost. This can happen. So this is basically like localized damage to cells of the leaf, and then pretty widespread. So it looks like these leaves will probably individually die at the end of this process. So most of what we talk about when we talk about pathology would be, as we introduced already, organisms that are basically eating the plant. So we'll spend a bit of time talking about animals that are herbivores. So animals that eat plants, that's a lot of animals. A lot of animals of different sizes. So I want to take the time today to kind of split out these different sizes, different eating strategies of these different animals. I'm not really planning to train any pathologists today, but hopefully maybe just give you an introduction to the variety of pathology examples you might encounter, and maybe if you're kind of interested, maybe set you on your way to learning more about this. So we have animals that eat like whole plants, all the way down to smaller animals that might be nibbling on parts of plants. So start off with a little more of the familiar version. Big animals taking pieces of plants that they chomp with their big teeth. So I think that's probably a fairly easy way to look at a plant and say, yeah, something has chewed this plant. So whole organs are missing. Sometimes, as we just talked about with the secondary compounds, maybe selectively eating the younger tissue of a plant. You'd see biting or tearing marks on this plant in the place where the chewing has happened. And I guess you prevent against this by excluding somebody. So deer, this is a study from Wisconsin. You probably encountered deer as a major influencer of plant communities. Has that come up for anybody before? Anybody have deer eat their plants at home? So we have in Wisconsin and many parts of the country a lot more deer than would be naturally present. So the predators have been removed. There are wolves in northern Wisconsin, but mostly not wolves around and not animals that are really putting predator pressure on deer. So in the absence of predators, these deer are more abundant and they got to eat stuff. And they are animals with brains. They get to choose what is more optimal for them to eat. So it's turned into an interesting area of study. Like, all right, we have a lot of deer. What do they eat? What do they eat more of? What do they eat less of? Maybe you've had this in your garden, right? You put plants in, you can buy plants from the store that say they're deer proof, right? So you buy plants that are bitter, toxic, thorny, tough. Some of those plants will be protected against deer, and it basically amounts to being less tasty than the other stuff around. So given a selection of plants to chew on, the deer will opt for something that's easier to eat. So less bitter, less toxic, less thorny, less tough. And over the amount of time that we've had lots of deer, so this like post settlement era where we've let the deer numbers get high, the wolf numbers have been down. There's a long-term effect where some of these plants, a lot of cases, native plants, are being unfairly eaten or disproportionately eaten than other native and sometimes non-native plants. So this was a study from 2014, and they put some species into the categories of winners and losers. So to do this experiment, you can basically take areas where there are deer and areas where you exclude deer and compare the plant communities as far as who survives and who maybe doesn't. So just a section from that study, winners and losers, and I've illustrated some of them here. This is a non-native plant we call hawkweed, Heraceum aurantiacum, native anemone plants. And then over here on the right side are some of the losers. A lot of times some of our, I don't know, I guess they end up becoming more rare plants because they're disproportionately destroyed by deer. So large animals, pretty easy to see the effects of that. Kind of intermediate size, so there are insects that are smaller animals themselves, but their chewing strategies are similar to what we see in the big herbivores. So pick some examples of insects that we see evidence of their damage by like chewing. They're chewing holes in leaves or chewing up entire leaves a little bit at a time. And among those, one you might be familiar with in your garden, a lot of our problem insects are non-native insects. So this is one not from here, Japanese beetle. This is one that's very abundant at a certain time of year. and doesn't seem to be too picky about what it eats. So if you get this on plants, they're pretty thorough at chewing holes in leaves. They just are really abundant. And I got a map of where the old Japanese beetles were. This is from 2015, so you're probably, if you live around this area, you probably encountered your share of Japanese beetles, and I didn't check up on the updated map, but I'm sure it's much more purple in our area than it used to be in 2015. So as far as I know, still marching their way across and destroying all kinds of plants in the process. Thanks, Japanese beetle. Even smaller, they're animals that, this is a kind of animal called a thrips. It's the same thing in the singular and plural. One thrips, two thrips. These are pretty small. I don't have a scale bar here, but you can kind of gauge maybe by the size of these plant hairs. So much smaller than the Japanese beetle. And their feeding strategy a lot of times is this, kind of looks more like they've scraped a portion of the surface. So they're not like taking off, cutting holes into leaves, but more kind of scraping it up. Some example of thrips damage. Another small insect. Ended up, a lot of the stuff I put on here are pests we see in the greenhouse. So I don't know how much you encounter these in your own plants, but if you come down to the greenhouse sometime, I can show you all kinds of pests. And this is one of the ones we have called a spider mite. It is an arachnid, and it makes a web. And they're very tiny. And then in their web, they chew up the plant. So you see it's, if you wanted to use your pathology smarts to know what's destroying your plant, then finding a web like this would probably be a decent indication you're looking at spider mites. So those were herbivores of different sizes. And we talked earlier about being specialized. Here are some examples of specialized herbivores. And I chose some that basically have the name of the thing they eat in their name. So potato beetle is fond of oak trees. No, wait, potatoes. So potato beetle, fond of potato plants. Tomato hornworm, you might have seen on your tomato plants, and so on. So again, relating to what we talked about before, this idea that one herbivore will be more effective at basically working around the defenses of a particular plant and will basically evolve to specialize on that plant. So keying into like modifying its behavior so that it's drawn to that plant, so that it exclusively visits that plant. And you get to a situation where these animals are really dependent on that plant for their food. So it could be because there's a particular kind of defense that needs to be worked around, or it could just be that they've developed that as their specialized plant of preference. So one of our more notorious plants with specialist herbivores on it, well, not just one species, but we have a few species of milkweed. And milkweeds, if you've encountered them, they are very toxic to insects. So they get the name milkweed because they have milky sap that comes out. I made the mistake one time. I got some sap on my hands and forgot about it, and then touched my tongue with that hand, and it was pretty gross. So bitter, a lot of alkaloids in there, defense molecules. And so your average like herbivore off the street would not be able to eat this plant without experiencing the toxic effects. But it's sort of a flip-flop. So as a plant that was not being eaten for the most part, it was sort of a food resource that was available if somebody could figure out a way around it. And it turns out there's quite a few. So maybe you're familiar with the monarch caterpillar. That's one of the more notorious eaters of milkweeds. It's an animal that turns into a lovely butterfly that people often are interested in. nice looking caterpillar. It's got a strategy for eating around the parts of this plant that produce the milky sap. Other ones, we've got aphids, bugs, caterpillars, beetles. And another connection here is a lot of these are brightly colored. So a lot of these animals, in addition to basically eating a toxic plant, are able to take some of the toxins from the plant and put them into their body. So colorful animals sometimes can be a sign to animals that eat them that they are not good to eat.